Good morning, everyone. We are so glad that you're here this morning. And I'm delighted to, one, see you all, welcome you to St. John's, and two, be able to welcome Brian McLaren here. I want to speak just a couple minutes about the Front Porch itself, but before I do that, let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer and some silence. Let us pray. May all your life be a prayer, a holy kiss. May all your life be a prayer learning from each day afresh, learning what it is to see God in you and God in your neighbor. May all your life be a prayer, an offering of presence and peace poured out and replenished. May all your life, your fantastic, dirty, messy, holy life be a prayer. Amen. My name is Abby Moon, and I'm the interim rector here at St. John's, and I want to say welcome to all of you in person, and those of you who are watching online. We are delighted that you are tuning in or here present with us today. And here at St. John's, we like to say that wherever you are on your spiritual journey, we welcome you, and we mean that. So we're delighted if it's your first time to be here in this space with us this morning, or if you've been here since birth and had no choice in it, we're glad you chose to be here today. We are thrilled to be hosting Brian McLaren today as a part of our Front Porch offering here at St. John's. And I want to share with you a little bit about this new thing that's happening at St. John's called the Front Porch. The Front Porch idea began as a dream in St. John's strategic plan about 4 years ago to create a space where the spiritually curious may encounter the divine. The hope is that the Front Porch will invite anyone who participates in a course to deepen their expression of their knowledge of who they are and also deepen their spiritual lives. We will be offering contemplative practices, events like this, and classes that are rooted in Christian spirituality. In your pews, you're going to find one of these little cards, and it's the Front Porch card. And essentially, we'd love for you to fill it out so we can keep you up to date with anything going on at St. John's and the Front Porch, rather. It also has a spot for questions for Brian McLaren. So we will have questions and answers. If you'd write them down, we'll bring them forward. You'll find them in your pews. And this card, watch this, my entire staff is going, oh, look, she didn't use it. You can take half home with you. And that keeps you up to date about the mission statement of the Front Porch and also our next events that are coming up. So take that with you. Do fill out the other side, which is your name, email, phone, or just your questions, whatever you're most comfortable with, and whether or not we can add you to that emailing list. I also want to draw your attention, if you might be so desired to support the ministries out of St. John's, you have this great card in your pew also that tells you how you can donate. We would love to receive those. They're not required, but if you feel that move towards generosity, please look at that card also. So, we are glad that you are here, Brian. Brian is an author, a speaker, an activist, and a public theologian, a former college English teacher and a pastor. He's a passionate advocate for a new kind of Christianity. And if you've looked at the titles or read all of his books, I will say I haven't read them all yet, Brian, but there's goals to be had. You'll notice from the titles that it's about seeking. And he's definitely a shepherd and a storyteller. The gift of having some time with you in the past 24 hours is realizing the gift that he has of listening deeply to story and inviting those stories to be shared and shepherding along the way to those who are questioning, those who are curious, those who are deeply spiritually hungry. And at the same time, a balance of being a prophet to the institutions who crave to assist and companion those who are spiritually hungry, and how to do that the best way possible. And so at the same time of being a companion on the way, he's a bit of a prophet to the larger vision and institution of established institutions. And I give thanks for the uncomfortable moments in a safe space, both as a leader in the church and one who desires to see each person know that they are indeed loved and they indeed belong in the world we live in. I am delighted to share this space with him. He has spoken at so many different forums, from personal speaking engagements to this, to CNN, New York Times, Christian Today, Christian Century, you name it. He's been a person who has been sought after to speak on many different points of spirituality. He comes to us from South Florida, drove up for the day, and we are grateful for all that he is and his call here. Thank you, Brian, for all that you will share today.
Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks. Well, hi, everybody. Anytime you get a really nice introduction like that, you just want to say, let's lower expectations as much as possible. I'm really happy to be with some fellow Floridians here. I've lived in Florida for 12, I guess going on 13 years. So, but I'm one of those people, my parents, we lived in upstate New York, where my first memory of trick-or-treating was in a snowstorm. So my parents always loved to come south for a week or two in the winter, and then my wife and I moved down from the DC area, where I had been a pastor for 24 years, and before that, for about 10 years, a college English teacher. And what I would like to do in our time together today is I would like to give you a tool and then hopefully give you some practice using the tool. Now, a tool can help you, but it's not always appropriate for all settings, right? So this tool I'm giving you could be abused. Every tool that can be used well can be used badly. So this is just a tool, and I hope it will be useful for you in helping you understand yourself and your own spiritual journey and struggles, maybe understanding people you love, maybe understanding people you find it really hard to love, and maybe even understanding things that happen in larger spaces of religion, if you're Episcopalian, thinking about the Episcopal Church, or thinking about Christianity in America in general, or even thinking about religion in general, and maybe even human development in general. So this is a tool. And I came across this tool by mistake. I was a college English teacher, and a lot of people don't know this, but when you teach college, very often you've never had a single course in education. Now, some of you who've been to college are thinking, yeah, I think that makes sense of a lot of my profs. But I was that. I had a master's degree in literature, but I'd taken very little in the way of education. So our department said, for all of our teachers, we'd like to give you some educational training, and it's free. And I'm Scottish, and my dad always said, you know, if you're Scottish, you really like free stuff. So I went for this day-long training, and we were introduced to a theorist in the field of education and human development. And he had a theory, a model of how adolescents develop. And I think you can understand if I say it this way. At the end of the day, again, this was just for my job as a teacher, but I felt it had been a spiritual experience, because things that had been tearing me apart in my religious life made sense because of that training in human development. From there, I became interested in a bunch of different theories, and in fact, at the end, and I think it's the third appendix of Faith After Doubt, I just give a chart giving about a dozen different theorists, and what I've tried to do is synthesize some of their insights into a really simple model, a tool to try to understand how people develop spiritually. And I'm going to give you 4 stages, super easy to remember. Then I'm going to sneak in a 5th stage. I'm going to call it stage 0. And then I'm going to add one little complication. But the 4 stages are really simple. I'll give them to you right now. Some of you have read the book, so this will be a review. The first stage where you think we would begin is simplicity. We start with keeping things simple. And simplicity is the stage. When we speak of raising children, we mean raising them into simplicity. And simplicity's focus, you could say, is dualism, meaning children don't know what's dangerous. Children don't know what's safe. Children, until they get some training, don't know what's right or wrong. And so they need some trusted authority figures, usually parents, but others as well, to help them create two categories in their mind. And one is a positive category, the other is a negative category. And everything that comes to them, because of the training they receive, they think, do I put this in the good category or the bad category? Insiders, outsiders. Safe, dangerous. Yummy, yucky, right? And all of those categories start getting built at a very young age. You could even think of this before language. That's mom's face. That's somebody else's face. And this sense in a very deep way, the work of our childhood to be raised to be a somewhat civilized person is letting a group of authority figures put in you a set of categories, and you become adept at putting things in those right categories. It's really simple. Not easy. I remember getting in a whole lot of trouble once. I was probably about 11 or 12 years old, and I didn't have much theology, but I did know how to pray. And I remember praying, God, will you just make me a robot so I do the right thing? Because if you leave this up to me, I'm going to keep messing it up, you know. But it just shows you how deeply embedded that sense of right and wrong already was in me. Now, a lot of religions, you can understand why religions would specialize in these two categories: right, wrong, us, them, orthodox, heretical, safe, dangerous, faithful, unfaithful, godly, ungodly. You can understand why a lot of religions would specialize in stage one, and you can imagine why they would say, that's all we have to offer. And if you ever go beyond stage one, you're leaving the faith. You can see why that would happen. Add this, little fact that I think we don't take seriously enough. When you think that 400 years ago, the average lifespan of our ancestors was about half of what it is for us. And so, and then also go back 400, 500 years, most people started having children in what we would call as teenagers, right? So think of this, most people were getting married by the time at a time we would consider them adolescents. So let's say you spend your first 17 or 18 years learning the rules of simplicity from your parents and grandparents and elders and priests and rabbis and so on. You spend your first 17 years learning them. You spend your next 20, 25 years having children. And what do? You teach those rules to the children. And you don't live long after that. So you can see people's lives were framed by simplicity. It's all they needed. And their religious community specialized in simplicity. But there would be a few people who would get to the frontiers of simplicity, and they would enter into another world of complexity. And that's the second stage. And that's when your two simple categories stop working. So, look, this is super unpleasant even to talk about, but it's a reality we have to address. You all have been seeing, we just think the news can't get any worse about clergy sex abuse. And of course, the Catholic Church has been getting a lot of the attention, but there's plenty of it in the Protestant church too. And so we have this phenomenon of sex abuse, do you think that sex abuse only started happening since the 1950s? Of course not. And the only difference is that the systems that were, the old boys network and the patriarchal systems that were protecting clergy, there was no one there to challenge them, right? So I want you to just think, I mean, it's heartbreaking to think about this, but just for a minute, not hundreds, not thousands, tens of thousands of children through over hundreds and hundreds of years who were abused and yet saw everyone respect those abusers. Now imagine they have this world in their mind, a set of categories, good, evil, authorities, who are given God-given power. And they've now got data in the secret, deepest part of their being that tells them that is a bunch of crap, right? That it tells them that binary description is not the whole story. So we've got to understand that in the heart of hearts of people, even though they were playing the game of simplicity, behind the scenes, it wasn't that simple. You have to think of some of those priests or bishops who are finding their fellow priests and bishops doing terrible things. Behind the scenes, they're thinking, this isn't all what it seems like, You have to imagine young people joining a monastery. And when they become part of the monastery, they realize that the abbot or the abbess is mentally ill. And this is a sick place. So suddenly you realize things come up in people's lives where those simple binaries of good, evil, us, them, right, wrong, safe, dangerous, those simple binaries start to break down. And people have to live with it. They have to live with this increasing complexity. And so what do? They try to find a way to survive. And so if stage one, we could say, is a stage of dualism, stage two becomes a stage of pragmatism. How do I survive in this system? For all the women here, imagine what it was like for such a huge part of human history to be a woman and be told by everybody that you were not as smart as men. And you just looked at your dad and thought, are you kidding me? And so I think in many ways in a patriarchal system, the women would end up in stage two way faster than the men. Because the binary that's been told them, male, dominant, superior, female, subdominant, inferior, that just made no sense to them. They just saw it wasn't true. So I think longer than we realize, there's been an awful lot of people venturing into stage two, and they figure out how to get along. In recent years, I've been interested. I grew up Protestant, so we weren't that big on saints, but I've become really interested in saints and mystics. And two that really especially fascinate me are Hildegard von Bingen, lived about 100 years before St. Francis, and Teresa of Avila. And here are these two extraordinary women leaders in Catholic history in a church system, and Julian of Norwich is another, who they're given no voice, but they find a way to get a voice. First, you start to realize that the orders were a place where nuns could, in a sense, say, we're going to create our own little world here, and we will try to keep those men out of it, right? And so they create spaces. They find a way to survive in a system that they know is not all it's put up to be. And I think what's happened for a lot of people is they they have learned to play the games of stage 1 in public when in secret, in private, they're in stage 2. They play simplicity, but in their private life, they live with complexity. And I think that covers an awful lot of people. And a lot of people spend their whole lives in complexity. There's enough to keep them busy there, just as there is in simplicity. I think some people move to the frontiers of complexity, and something happens. And it goes something like this. I think you can follow me here. You are aware that our group behaves in certain ways. We have certain rules. And then you meet people who are from another group. Now, your group says, those people are wrong, we're right. Those people are dangerous, we're safe. Well, you've already found out that some of us aren't safe, and you find out that some of them are really wonderful. And so now, what are you left to do? You start to think, not only are the rules of our group wrong, but they're harmful. They cause damage to people. And now it's not just a matter of how do I survive, it's how do I become a morally responsible person to address the wrongs and ignorance of the in-group that I'm part of. Does that make sense? So it's not just how do I survive in my in-group, it's I don't want to just survive. I want to try to address and name and maybe even change the status of my in-group. And when that happens, you cross into this third stage, where now you're saying, I'm not just trying to profit and survive. I'm actually going to raise my voice, and I'm going to not be silent anymore about my discontent. And so now I'm in this third space, and something else really significant happens if I'm in this space. I start critiquing, and I critique this, and I critique this, and I become really, really good at critique. And so very often in the early stages of stage 3, or the early season of stage 3, I'm critical of everybody and everything. But then a moment might come where I realize the critique that I'm using against everybody else, I've never turned on myself. And when that happens, you cross this threshold where stage 3 is no longer comfortable for you anymore. In other words, there's early in stage 3, you think, those idiots, they don't see what I see, right? And you have this feeling of superiority, and you stand above looking down. I'll tell you, I had a moment in graduate school where I didn't have these 4 words yet, these 4 stages yet. But I think I was starting to get it. And I know we've got at least one fellow English major here, but I was in a class that all graduate students in literature take, which is it's usually called Methods of Literary Criticism, or it's a methods course. And so you find out that there's all different ways to read a novel or read a piece of literature. You can read from a Marxist reading, where you read the novel looking for class conflict or looking for class superiority, and you pay huge attention to economic and social class. Or you take a Freudian reading, where you read a novel and you look for people's Oedipal and Electra complexes, and you look for the interplay of id, ego, and superego in characters' lives. Right? You can see this. So you've got a Freudian reading, a Marxist reading. You've got all different kinds of readings. You've got readings that focus on race. You've got readings that focus on a philosophical outlook or theological readings of text. So you've got all of these ways to read texts and explain what's going on. And I remember sitting in my literary criticism class, and it suddenly dawned on me that as a Christian, I'd been given ways of showing how every other religion was wrong. And I'd been given tools to critique every other religion. And then I thought, it's like you take a chair and you stand on the chair, so you're standing up looking down at everyone. The chair is your theory. By the way, remember I said tools can be dangerous? That applies to this tool I'm giving you right now. You stand on your chair and you look down at everyone. I said, what happens when you take your saw and you cut the legs out of your own chair. And you say, for example, the Freudian says, I understand everything based on psychosexual urges and impulses. And then you say, I hope you don't mind me being somewhat graphic here, you're standing erect in front of a group of people. Do you ever think about what you're doing right now, right? And suddenly you think, oh my gosh, am I playing out these same things I'm looking at in everybody else? Am I playing them out this moment? Does that make sense? And when you turn your critique on yourself, I think you've reached the deeper stages of stage 3 perplexity. So we've got simplicity, complexity, perplexity. I'm sure you've got it. And you can see how we would get there. A lot of people get to perplexity in the Christian faith, and they feel completely alienated because they have never met another Christian in perplexity. They basically feel, I'm in a territory that no one else has gone to and stayed Christian. And so they think, I'm done. I can't be a Christian anymore. No Christians think this way or ask this kind of question. There is none of this kind of self-critique allowed in Christianity. We can critique everybody else, but we can't do that to ourselves. And I don't want to be part of a community that is unwilling to engage in self-critique. And so you just think, I'm done, I'm out, I'm not a Christian anymore, I'm an atheist, or maybe you find some other religious community where you think there is room for people. And you don't need this language, but there is room for people in perplexity, you know. But I would say more and more people at younger and younger ages are entering into perplexity. You may be familiar with a wonderful writer, I just love her dearly, Kate Bowler. Kate's a theology professor. And Kate is going along, doing great in her career, and is diagnosed with stage 4 cancer as a young mother. And she's been living with cancer for several years now, right? But she, in a sense, suddenly you're writing analytically about religion. You're a scholar of American religious life. And suddenly you're facing the fact that your prayers aren't being answered, and that when you think the worst possible thing that could happen is just the first in a train of other worst possible things that happen. And what happens when your theological system is shattered? It's a scary place to be. I think, though, what happens for more and more people is they persist in stage 3, and they begin to meet a few people who they get the feeling they have also marinated in stage 3 for a while. They have these critical thinking skills that I've developed, that I'm developing, and they're even farther along with me. And here's what I think often for people precipitates leaning over the edge of stage 3 into what I would call stage 4, or harmony, or solidarity. They do two things sort of in rapid succession. First, they say, I am critical of everybody else. I know what I'm against. I can see through everything. What am I for? How am I any better than anybody else, except that I can criticize them better than they can criticize themselves? And when you say, I've become cynical about my own cynicism and critical of my own critique, disillusioned with my own disillusionment, at that point, your discontent rises and you begin to think there's got to be something beyond this. And at that moment, if you look back and you have, in a sense, you feel compassion for yourself. I'm just trying to do what's right and I'm in a mess. And then you think, but you know what? Back when I was in stage 1, I was just trying to do what's right. And back in stage 2, I was just trying to survive and do what's right. And then when at that moment when you have compassion on yourself in stage 3 and on your former self in stage 2 and on your former self in stage 1, And then on your neighbors in all their different stages, when compassion overwhelms you, it seems to me, you, in a sense, you graduate from critique to compassion. Does that make sense? And if you look at those then as 4 stages of human development, I think you get a feel. Well, let me just say, first of all, that's what has helped me make sense of my own spiritual life. And it wasn't like somebody told me this and I said, this is what I have to do. This is what I was going through. And I felt that a tool like this could help me understand the dynamics. Now look, don't think of this as, this is stage 1, this is stage 2, this is stage 3. Instead of thinking of it like that, if you do think of it like that, you just have to say, what we often do is something like this. In other words, we go back and forth. But instead, maybe think of it like a tree with rings, where you have a center ring, and that is simplicity. We get the basics of right and wrong, good and evil. Then we move to pragmatism. How can I survive in a world that is more complex than my understanding that I inherited? And then we move into perplexity, where I have to develop the ability to critique. In a sense, in stage 1, I was told, believe what your authorities tell you. That was my work then. But in stage 3, doubt what your authorities tell you. Look for their false motives. Look for their blind spots, because you could be led into a lot of trouble by authority figures if you just believe everything you're told. So you understand, it was your work to believe in stage 1. It's your work to doubt in stage 3. And then you graduate and you add another ring. You don't ever lose the earlier rings. You keep them, but you develop new capacities. If you want to think of tools, you develop a new set of tools. Your toolbox expands through those stages. So that's the big idea. Now, I want to complicate it in 2 slight ways. First, I want to say, I think there's a stage 0. And that's the stage we're in before we have learned those 2 categories. So all of us, when we're infants, we don't have those categories. And boy, I wish I could go back to the young father me and sort of, give this insight to the younger version of me. Because when you realize that your babies, when you have little babies, they're not trying to be bad. When they scream in the middle of the night and wake you up, when they throw a temper tantrum and are rolling on the floor in the grocery store, they're not trying to be bad. Because their job in stage 1 is to let everybody know when they're in pain. In a sense, you think of it, before that baby's born, the baby doesn't have a name. The baby doesn't exist. Nobody pays attention. This baby's got to get some attention. This baby has got to demand some rights. And so the ability to stand up for yourself and demand rights is something that we take for granted, but sometimes people don't get it. So let's call that stage 0. And here's the thing. You never stop needing to have a name and a voice and actually the right to inconvenience someone else when you're in need. But then if you think of it in that way, you understand all of us grow, we go through different experiences, but we reach points in our lives when we're in such great pain, we're in such great need, that we revert to stage 0. And we're willing to impose upon anyone to get help. Now, sometimes it's as simple as, I was just reading a friend of mine, a blog post from a friend of mine, gifted writer, many of you maybe know John Pavlovitz. And John had a brain tumor removed a couple of weeks ago. And he told the story of, they did the brain surgery through his nose, his nasal cavity, and he got a huge hemorrhage after the surgery, and blood is just pouring out of him. And he just starts screaming and, yelling for help. He, at that point, wasn't, excuse me, could I interrupt you for a brief second? I'm having a bit of, it was, and it's desperation, right? We all reach stages of desperation. But sometimes this also helps me understand how addiction works. Because in the process of addiction, the body begins to make demands that end up in some ways reverting us to stage 0. And any of you who've struggled with addiction, you may have stories in your life where you watched the stage 2 level of pragmatism, you lost your job or you stopped performing on your job, you weren't pragmatically functioning well. And then you started lying to people and stealing from people. And in a sense, you were in a process of regression to where there was only one craving that was desperately desiring to be fulfilled. And when I understand that, it helps me say, oh, of course, this is what happens, and it happens to us in different ways. So stage 0, that's my first complication. And then the only other one I'll add is that I think if you spend long enough in stage 4, harmony or solidarity. Harmony because you've come to peace with your own growth process to some degree, and solidarity because you're also able to have empathy for other people being where they are in their own growth process. When you're in that stage 4, it eventually becomes your new it becomes your new simplicity. It just becomes normal. It starts to work. And one of the reasons it's a new simplicity is because love ends up being what matters most to you. And love, now you feel like, oh, life makes sense. It's all about love. But guess what? If you start feeling that way, pretty soon you'll notice some people in your life who are really hard to love. How do I love a person in that situation? And then I think you enter into your new complexity. And then my guess is that the process starts to repeat itself. And in a sense, eventually you realize that these different tasks, this task of stage 0, having an I, a name, a person who has needs, and then stages 1, 2, 3, and 4, that they're just tool sets that we develop and live with for the rest of our lives. So, I want to stop there and see if you have just anyone wants to raise their hand with a question or a comment or a pushback, and I'll be glad to respond to those.
If you hear him, will you say him again?
And I'll repeat your question for folks who are watching remotely. Yeah. Yes, and tell me your name.
Okay. Sherry?
Hey, Sherry.
I just wondered, Thomas Keating's books have helped me a lot with the stages of spiritual development.
Yes.
But before that, I've never heard anyone talk about that, and it just, it was such an upending thing, and I just wondered why our faith communities not talking about it, because it's kind of leaving us stranded in the wilderness.
Oh my. So well said. Sherry, right? So Sherry's question is, why are we just hearing about this now? We were left stranded without much help in this regard. So here's the reason why I think a lot of us were, Sherry. I think it's because our faith communities were in stage 1. Our priests were in stage 1. Our bishops were in stage 1. At least publicly they were. Privately they may have been somewhere else, but publicly they were. And everything functioned around stage 1. And if all there is stage 1, there's nothing to talk about. I think that's a big reason. Now I want to add a dimension of this. I think in American history, when you add the complexity that what happened here on Turtle Island, starting in 1492, leading up to the 1600s through the 1800s, that we had a group of people who were Christian and white from Europe who cared about right and wrong, but they were stealing the lands of the indigenous people, and then they were kidnapping and enslaving generations of people from Africa. And I think what that did in the United States is create a really convoluted form of stage 1, where a group of people had to become obsessed with a certain kind of morality to distract themselves from the immorality that was inherent in their system. And I think that's another reason why American religion is so strongly a stage one phenomenon. Now, I think part of what's happened in the last 50 years or so is that we've seen a big emergence of a stage two form of Christianity, which is sort of the mega church prosperity gospel thing. And you understand it's about, like, you know, if I say the name Joel Osteen, do you all know who I mean? So a lot of people criticize Joel Osteen. I'm sure a lot to criticize, but I look at Joel Osteen and I realize, what does he have? 40,000 people attend his church, something like that. But I realize probably almost all of them were in stage one churches where they went every Sunday and were told who to hate or told who they were superior to. And when they show up at Joel's church, he doesn't tell them to hate anybody, at least not overtly. He tells them, show up for work early and work with a good attitude and have a smile on your face. Well, that's stage two stuff. That's how to survive in this world. And we could critique Joel that he doesn't go further and ever address any of the systemic injustices and all the rest. That's true. But at least he's giving a place for stage one people to have a bigger framework, if that makes sense. So that's part of the reason. But here's the other fact, and this is one of the reasons I've been so interested in studying the saints. If you're familiar with Teresa of Avila, she wrote a book called The Interior Castle. The interior castle is a stage theory. St. John of the Cross, who talks about the dark night of the soul, it's a stage theory. And you start finding out that, no, this has been there in a lot of Christian history. In the Middle Ages, there was a whole approach that was called the via purgativa, the via illuminativa, and the via unitiva. I love the Eastern Orthodox term for it. It's theosis is the via unitiva. Photosis, I love, is the via illuminativa. Photosis, like photonizing your life, letting light penetrate your life. And I've just forgotten the first osis, somebody might remember, of the purgative way. But at any rate, so these stage theories have been there, but I think they fell out of fashion in both modern Catholicism and modern Protestantism for these, and I'm sure many other reasons. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Okay. What a great question. Your name again? Beth Ann. Thank you, Beth Ann. So that question is, how do we help children and to understand the stages they're in and to help them develop and grow and to be at the stages where they are. And first of all, this is a place where educators are 10 steps ahead of the rest of us because, you know, for example, if you're a math educator, you know in great detail the normal succession of skills. When I was an English teacher, I taught freshman English for many years. And in freshman English, you always start with a description essay. Why? Because description is one of the most basic skills. And then you do a definition essay, and then a classification, and then a comparison contrast class. So you have this sort of order of operations. In almost all fields of education, we have the sense of here's the order of operations. You learn things in this order. And you might have a disability that then we even know many people get stuck here, and then you need to help them do a workaround to get here. So we've done a lot of this in education, much less in spirituality, although that's changing. And so there have been a number of great Christian theologians and in the Christian community who are working with this, but it hasn't filtered down very much. In fact, I'll just tell you, I won't mention names here, but literally 15 minutes before Abby and I met up to come over here this morning, I was answering an email from a woman who works at one of the main curriculum publishers for church Sunday school curricula for children. And she's just convinced the head of her company to have the whole staff read Faith After Doubt. And this is, I don't mean this to criticize, but many of the curriculum companies, they have no concept of stages of development when they're writing curricula for our kids. What they have is a bank of Bible stories, and they try to tell the Bible stories, but they haven't really thought about how to teach those Bible stories. So, for example, how many kids have the Noah and the flood ark story? I mean, this is one of the most morally complex and disturbing stories in the whole Bible if you pay attention to it. I want to put, no one under 18 should read this story because it's really morally fraught on so many levels. It's a very sophisticated story, and it really is not a children's story, but it gets told to children because it has furry animals in it who all of their siblings are going to drown, right? So all that's to say, what I think we're in the early stages of, we're going to make a lot of progress in the next 50 years. Progress is already being made in this, but we have a lot of work to do. In the Episcopal Church, many of you would know the name Jerome Berryman and something called Godly Play. And Jerome took the work of Maria Cavalletti in Montessori education, and what they've done is developed a sort of methodology to say that here are ways into letting children become active learners. I think that's a big part of it. How do we help children become active learners? But I also think it's going to have really deep effects on the way that we teach children the faith moving forward. Maybe one other thing I could say about this, and then it'll be almost time for a break. I think, see if you can follow me here. If the status quo in Christianity, and look, Episcopalians have been an outlier in this in many ways and places. Any of the denominations that ordained women in the 20th century, the fact that they ordained women meant that they were going to read the Bible in more sophisticated ways than the denominations that didn't. Does that make sense? So any denominations that ordained women, in a sense, had to move out of simplicity in the way they interpreted the Bible. But we all know that there are many Episcopal churches that ordained women but have never interrogated, this just became one of the rules that they follow, and they haven't really looked at the nuances behind it. But if everybody's in stage one, and then they're teaching their children, of course they will teach their children a stage one way of seeing Christianity. It's all they can do. If you have people in stage two teaching children, they'll be able to teach children a stage one and a stage two understanding of Christianity. They'll teach stage one differently because it won't be the end. It will be a beginning point that leads to something else. But they won't be able to do much to help children with stage three. And then if you're in stage three, you'll be able to teach. I think one of our great challenges is getting enough teachers to a place where, and this is why stage 4 doesn't mean you've arrived. As I said, that becomes the new beginning. But there's something qualitatively different about stage 4 than stage 3. In stage 3, you're still angry at everybody who's below you. In stage 4, you understand, you have a compassion and understanding that there are things that are appropriate for people at the different stages. And so this, to me, is one of our great challenges. How do we get our teachers, and I would say our parents, to get to a place where they have this understanding in the way they teach their children? I'll tell you something interesting. I have a dear friend, Tina Sharmer, who's written a really wonderful book for any of you who are parents. It's called Shameless Parenting, and it's specifically about how we teach our children about sex. And in the field of sex education and sexual psychology, we know so much about sexual development at different stages. We know so much. It hasn't filtered down to most psychologists and pediatricians and educators, but once that information becomes available, one thing that all parents share, first, they've had sex, and so they have a little experience in that department, and they don't want to damage their children sexually, right? They don't want to put harmful things in their children. And what's interesting to me to watch as people are reading Tina's book is that they're, in a sense, it's introducing them to stage theory regarding sexuality. And so at any rate, I hope that helps. I think we're in the early stages of this, and I think we'll be in a better place in 10 or 20 or 30 years. But these are good questions. When we come back, I'd like to talk about how these stages could be a tool for you in your own spiritual development, starting, today. So we'll do a little practice with that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brian. We will take a 10-minute break. You're invited to stand up, stretch. You can go outside. There are refreshments available. Claire, are they in Alfred Hall or in the garden? They're in the garden. Please take a moment to head on out. Restrooms can be found on both hallways as you go, or in the Calhoun Street entrance. There are other restrooms there, along with the water fountain. But join us in Eve's garden. Come back right at about 11:05. We'll see you right in here. And pass your questions. Bring them right here to the podium if you filled out a question or filled out a card for information. Again, right back here at 11:05. Thank you, guys.
That's all right. That's all right. I know, I was sort of avoiding it, wasn't I? So first, before we go into the second session, I want to just return to the subject of race in relation to the four stages. And for all the white folks here, I want to tell you there is a whole body of literature by various different, well, this is for everybody, but it's especially important, I think, for white folks to think about this. There's a whole growing body of literature of people of different racial backgrounds talking about their own experience of stage development. In the appendix, I list several of them. But I want to invite white folks for a minute to think, what would it be like to grow up black in America or black in the church, and to start thinking about what additional challenges you would face with a Christian religion that was supervising. Oh.
There we go.
Oh, that's a relief. Okay. I wonder why my glasses kept fogging up. But to imagine what it's like to grow up and have a dominant culture that is setting the categories of stage one, maybe outside your family, maybe also influencing your family. And in a sense, can you see how you would be forced to grow into stage two as a part of entering the world? And then you think, or the complexities, many Asian Americans who are writing about identity development, and they have stage theories of identity development, talk about certain ways that they find that they can play into the white majority culture, and then other places where the doors are shut. And so the complexities when you add race, or if you're a minority religion, if you're Muslim in America or Jewish in America, these complexities of identity. It's one of the reasons why I think some of the most important writers that we have now are writers of color in the Christian community and outside as well. But I'll just give you an example. There's a kind of a renaissance going on right now of the rediscovery of a great 20th century theologian named Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman, growing up as a Christian just across the state near St. Augustine, and watching, and if you read his biography, you just find out, first of all, how race played a role in this, but then in his own religious upbringing, his father died when he was young, single digits, I forget exactly how old. And the preacher wouldn't bury his father because his father didn't attend church. His mother attended church, but his father didn't. So he just wouldn't perform a funeral for him. So now the family's thinking, what are we going to do? They find an itinerant preacher passing through who will perform the ceremony. At the ceremony, at the funeral for his father, the preacher preached how his father was in hell because he didn't go to church. And so Howard Thurman, imagine being an 8 or 9-year-old boy and the complex feelings you would have at this moment about your religion, right? Or then you think, whatever a person's race, imagine a gay person growing up in a church, coming to terms, understanding their sexual identity and those simplistic categories of stage one being applied to them, and now they're just thinking, how do I deal with this? So I think once we just start to feel that, we realize that the reign of white simplicity, its days are numbered, and thanks be to God. But part of what we see going on in this state, we all know, a whole bunch of people who are saying you're not allowed to teach critical race theory. You're not allowed, right? It's the attempt to impose white dominant simplicity on the world again. So we have these we see the complexity of this playing out around us, of people wanting to retreat to an old familiar simplicity. And one of the things I didn't say in the first session that I should have, to further complexify this stage theory so that the tool can be used and not abused, is that people can go backwards. I call it, when you move from stage 1 to stage 2, I would call that maturing in your faith. When you move from stage 2 to stage 3, I would call it maturing in your faith. But when you're in stage 3 and you get scared and you say, I want to find a church that does all my thinking for me so I can go back, I would call that bad faith. Because now you're using your faith as permission not to grow. You're using your faith as an escape from truth rather than a growing into truth. And I think this is what cults are. And I think conspiracy theories that we see so popular right now, this is an example of frightened people, and the complexity and perplexity that they enter into frightens them so much they want to revert to a very simplistic world where all of their simplistic categories are reified or re-intensified. And of course in religion, you can tack God's name to it, which gives it all kinds of additional power. So I hope that maybe adds one more level of nuance to what we talked about in our first session. But what I'd like to do in this session is I'd like to talk about the spiritual life. And some years ago, I wrote a book called Naked Spirituality. And in that book, I was, in a sense, I was trying to say, what is the spirituality of the 4 stages? And what I did is I tried to simplify it as much as I could into one-word prayers. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you this series of one-word prayers that I think work, that are part of the work of each of the 4 stages. And so if you're taking notes, you know, feel free. Otherwise, you'll find this is a book I wrote called Naked Spirituality. But you don't even so much need to remember these as much as just the idea that we can simplify the work of each of the 4 stages and let that be a part of our prayer life. So, stage 1, simplicity. And this goes back to the earlier questions. If I were teaching children, what are the spiritual practices they need? Here's what I'd say for people in stage 1. And remember, you always have stage 1 with you for the rest of your life, so this is always relevant. The first one-word prayer would be the word hear, H-E-R-E. And when I say hear, I mean, remember in school when the teacher would call roll, you know, Johnny here, Mary here, Joey here. Here is your way of showing up. And I think part of what we need to help people do at the very earliest stages, and that sort of core part of our own spiritual life, is whatever our age and stage, is to just show up and to be in the presence of God and say, I'm here. And many of us, when we begin to experience contemplative prayer, that's how it begins. Instead of coming in with a bunch of words, we try to just be quiet and be here. I think that's one of the most basic steps of all. I mentioned Howard Thurman. So here, imagine Howard's father has died. The circumstances of his death make him have deep ambivalence about the church. And you all understand this living in Tallahassee. In Howard's backyard was a big live oak tree. His mother is struggling to make a living. She's working so hard to make money. And his grandmother is, in many ways, his custodian. And he feels lonely and he feels confused. He goes out in his backyard. He sits down and leans against the tree. And he says, in the presence of that tree, I felt love and acceptance and safety. And that tree came to represent for him what we might call a thin place. It came to represent for him a portal to the presence of God. In a sense, the tree wasn't talking to him. It was listening to him. And in the silence of the life, and he felt the life and vitality of the tree, he felt safety. He also describes in his childhood that he would go out and fish at night and row a rowboat out into, I guess it was probably Indian River, somewhere along there. And he would go out and sit in the boat and fish at night and be alone in the boat at night, rocking in the water, in the darkness. And he said the darkness felt like a presence to him. He didn't have to say anything. He could just be there in that loving, accepting, safe presence. I think if there's a starting point of what I would want to teach a child and what I'd want to help any adult who's trying to get back in touch with the very core of their spirituality, it would just be that word here, to learn to be quiet and, in a sense, not worry about what you have to say, not even worry about what you have to hear, but just to be able to be safe in the presence of embracing non-judgmental, knowing love, If I were to build a second word on that first stage of simplicity, it would be thanks. The act of gratitude, of noticing our blessings, noticing the gifts that we've received, beginning with this breath and this heartbeat and this meal. And just to notice and to experience appreciation. There's a great Catholic theologian named Joseph Pieper. And Joseph Pieper was the chaplain to the Vatican II process. A deeply wise man. And Joseph Pieper said, happiness does not consist in having. Happiness consists in appreciating. And I think there's such wisdom in this. So the act of helping people slow down to appreciate, and then to begin to understand first God as the presence when I'm just here and I'm accepted and I'm known and I'm loved. And second, the presence to whom I can give my thanks. And to be thankful. I have a dear friend who's a nun named Sister Simone Campbell. Some of you may have heard of her. She's just a fireball. And Sister Simone is a passionate, I think it's not an inappropriate word, a passionate warrior for economic justice. And but I was with Simone once, and we were having a meal together, and we were sort of figuring who's going to say the blessing, And Simone said, when I'm with my sisters, we're always praying, we just get tired of words about God. We have so many words about God. So she said, here's the prayer that we say around our meal. We sit at the table, and step one is we look at the food. We just all look at the food on our plate, look at the food being served, look at all the food, and we go, ah. And then second, she said, we look at the faces around the table and think of the gift of being with these other people. And we look at one another in the eye and we say, ah. She said, then we end our prayer by saying, ah. But that simple act of appreciation and thanks, I think, is a second skill, a second competency of this first stage. And then the third that I think is so important for people to get at the very beginning of their spiritual life, it's not only one word, it's one letter, O. And it's the feeling of awe. I think one of the greatest gifts all of us who are parents and grandparents can give to children in our lives is to convey to them our sense of awe. And I think if we can help people understand in those experiences of awe, of wonder, of being struck by beauty, when we say, oh, or wow, those experiences of wow, or oh, that we understand that's the essence of prayer. To acknowledge that the mystery and awe and wonder that we see is a fingerprint of God. It's a manifestation of whatever God is. And we help people at these early stages. Now, this does not require knowing the Noah and the Ark story. In fact, the Noah and the Ark story could really complicate here, thanks, and awe, and oh, or wow. I think there's a wonderful meaning to the Noah and the Ark story that we can be taught at some point. But if I were focusing on what are the very basic, the essence of the spiritual life, it would be here, thanks, and oh, or wow. By the way, I wrote about this in a book, and Annie Lamott wrote a book that was very, very similar, and her word for this is wow, and I kind of like wow even better. So that would be stage one, in simplicity. That's the simple basics we want. I would hope that people could get. Then we move to stage two. And this is the stage of pragmatism. And so the first of these words I would introduce is the word sorry. And sorry is when we acknowledge, I hurt someone. I failed to live up to my responsibilities. I did something harmful. And the act of being able to say sorry, it's a really profound act. It's a way of not denying, not saying, or making an excuse. She hit me first, so that's why I bit my sister. Not making an excuse. It's saying, whatever else happened, I am not happy that I bit you. And so now I make, and you understand by doing that, I make a really interesting distinction. I am not the worst thing I've ever done. The I who's saying sorry is able to distance myself from the thing I did. I'm sorry. I regret that. That I don't want to be defining of me. I want to separate myself from that going forward. Does that make sense? And to do this in the presence of God and God's grace is a beautiful and important thing, especially to teach someone who's in stage two, focusing on getting things done and accomplishing things and being pragmatic. Sorry. Next would be please. I'm sorry. That's going to be third. The next one is help. And help is my word for asking for help for myself. And help is a word that makes sense when I realize what life is asking of me right now is not easy or even possible for me. It's beyond my capability. I can't do it. And you see how help and sorry go together for someone who's learning things. We sometimes fall short. Other times we feel, I can't even do any better. So help is my way of, in the presence of God, saying, I don't have this ability. And rather than asking reality to shrink to the level of my current abilities, I'm inviting myself to grow to the challenges that reality is throwing me. Does that make sense? So help becomes a desire for growth and a desire for strength. And so then help very often leads me to say, what is it that I need? Oh, I need patience. Oh, I need endurance. Oh, I need strength. And so then we learn to name the help that we need. And do you understand, at a deep level spiritually, this takes us to a place where we're acknowledging the reality that life is really complex and life is really tough, and I can't handle it all. But here's where I know I need help, and I feel my desire to grow, and I'm going to express it. Then the third word, please, is when I do the same thing for other people. And I realize, my wife is having a rough patch, and she's feeling challenges that seem beyond her capacities right now. And so please, please give for her what I've learned to trust for myself. Please help her, gain the strength that she needs. Or please help our president or our governor or whatever and you understand what this allows us to do is instead of hating them or criticizing them, or it involves us in imagining them growing. Puts us in the world in a different way. So that would be the next 3 words. First, sorry, then help, then please. That's stage 2. We get to stage 3. And, oh my goodness, so much in life. This is where stage 3, I think, is so dynamic for those of us who grew up in stage 1 spiritual settings where we were given, a couple of us were talking during the break, we were given platitudes. Like, how about this one? God will never give you something you can't handle. Well, look, there's a way we say that to try to encourage people, right? But the fact is, plenty comes at us that we can't handle very well. And so part of stage 3 is saying, how am I going to trust God when so many of the things I've been told about God are proving to not be totally true? They maybe were encouraging, but they aren't actually factually true, right? When I mentioned Kate Bowler, her first book was called Everything Happens for a Reason, and the subtitle, And Other Lies I've Loved. And so a huge part of stage 3 is coming to terms with this struggle where now it's not easy to square what I've thought about God with what I'm experiencing in life. And so the first word I recommend as a prayer at this point is the simple word, when. When will this make sense? When will this be over? In the Bible, you find a lot of prayers that begin, how long? How long will reality seem to be so out of sync with anything I understand to be true of you, God? And you understand there's this element when you turn your complaint into when, because this really is a complaint. I don't like this about reality. I don't like it. What we're saying is, this may resolve in time, and I'm not going to make my final conclusion today. I'm going to admit that I don't like this, it doesn't make sense, and I'm feeling the tension, and I'm holding that tension with the word when. I think if we go a little bit beyond when, you keep waiting and waiting and it doesn't come, my next one-word prayer for stage 3 would be no. And I call this the prayer of rage, where I think, and we see it in the Bible a lot, but where we have every right to in a certain sense, raise our fist and say, this is unacceptable. I cannot stand this. I cannot abide by this. I refuse to accept this. Now, here's what's interesting. And I also refuse to keep talking to you about it. And so the refusal is the refusal. If you say it like this, here's what I hope for. Here's what I think is needed. Here's what I think is right. And here's what I think we have. No is saying, I refuse to lower my expectation or pretend that reality is okay. I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to continue to feel the pain. I'm going to continue to hold the distance. Does that make sense? I'm going to feel what Parker Palmer calls the tragic gap. I'm going to feel the tragedy that things are not as they should be. And I'm not going to try to resolve it. I'm not going to try to fix it. I'm just going to say, no, this is unacceptable. Boy, I wish somebody had told me I was allowed to do that. How about this? No, that explanation does not work for me. I don't have a better explanation, but that one stinks. and I'm not gonna pretend I'm satisfied with it. A word that is often used in the contemplative world is this is the acknowledgement of unknowing. The no is the refusal to simplify reality to my platitudes. It's just saying, I don't know how this makes sense. I don't know how this works. And I refuse to minimize the problem, and I refuse to give up on the problem. I'm going to live with the problem. I'm going to live with the gap. I'm going to live with the tension. I'm going to live with the pain. And my gosh, in stage 3, one of the things we learn to do is to live with unresolved pain and unresolved answers. And then I think, even beyond the no, what happens? You start by saying when, and then you say no, and the no doesn't resolve. And I think there's maybe the last step, the last third of the journey in stage 3 is in that simple one-word prayer, why? It's what you hear Jesus say on the cross. Why have you forsaken me? And the why, you understand, he's not saying, could you please explain the reasons for this? Because in a sense, you remember what he prays the night before? And of course, we will, every year during Holy Week, we revisit the depths of this story. He says, if this cup can pass away from me, take it away. And if not my will, but your will be done. And in a sense, he's saying, I don't really understand why I'm having to go through this. If there's some reason for it, I don't get it, but I want to do what's right, even if it's hard. And I think the why have you forsaken me? The why is it's not, I demand an answer. It's, I'm fully acknowledging I don't know. This doesn't make sense. I don't know. And I think in some ways we all hope we don't have to have too many of those moments in our lives, but I bet most of us, if not all of us, have at least had a few already. And I think we can predict there's a few more ahead of us. And the skill that you develop is the skill of learning to live with unknowing. And in a sense, living that question. I think if we live that question long enough, and I bet some of you will be able to resonate with moments like this. There come moments where somehow you say, I'm starting to get it now. I can't put it into words. I don't necessarily have an explanation. But I've been able to accept that this is reality, and I have to, and I'm going to live with this. I've somehow absorbed this into my life, and now I'm going to live anyway. And the word I'd like to use for this is the word behold. It's a word you find a lot in the Bible, and it basically just means open up your eyes and see what's there. I'll just be honest, and I bet some of you identify with this, and some of you maybe don't, but people, you think, oh, that's what they're going through. But when you start paying attention to the ecological crisis that we've created, the catastrophe that we've created, there is a kind of grief that comes over you. And that grief can take you into some pretty deep places. What did I just read this year's? I can't remember the number, but they do a bird survey every year of the number of birds in the United States, and since from 1970 to the present, it's like there are 300 million fewer birds in North America or something. It's just a staggering number. And you start facing these things and seeing the loss, and then I see the idiocy of our politicians, the absolute intolerable idiocy, and I want to scream, no. And I hold that out to God, and And then I reach this moment and I say, well, here it is. And I see a mockingbird fly onto the cabbage palm tree and start to sing. And I think, at least that one's still alive. And I want to appreciate its beauty. And some way by feeling the threat to it, I appreciate its beauty all the more. Here in Florida, we've had the record-breaking year of manatee deaths. And you see, where I live, I see manatees quite often. And I think, wow, there's, 10,000 of your kind that exist. And I think, Sister Manatee, I'm so sorry for what we human beings are doing. And so angry about our politicians. And I'm so angry about our economic system. And I look at you and I just want to see you. I want to appreciate you. Do you understand? That word behold becomes a word that helps you start to see what we have. I think of a friend of mine who tragically lost his wife at way too young an age, and he told me, he said, I don't feel, people say losing someone you love is like having your arm cut off. He said, that's not it. He said, it's like having 1/2 of every cell in your body ripped away from you. And he said, and he told me, I'm not sure I'm going to make this. He said, I just need you to know, I'm not sure I'm going to get through this. And he went through some deep times. And one day I saw him, and he said, it's like I woke up and I said, I'm still alive. I've survived. The grief will always be with me, but I can still breathe. Behold, I'm here. I'm still alive. And I think that's the beginning of that stage 4 spirituality, where you say, I'm so mad at all those stage 1 people. They just don't get it. And they're not changing even though I told them to. And you know what? They're my neighbors, and let me just try to love them and behold them. You understand what I'm saying? It's that behold. It's such a beautiful and key concept. And for us to learn to sit with that beholding and to just let that be a space of our spiritual life. And then that leads to the beautiful and simple word yes. And in stage 4, when we learn to say, what is mine to do in this mess? Being through what I've been through, seeing what I've seen, thinking what I've thought, doubting what I've doubted, experiencing what I've experienced, what is mine to do? And then in the presence of God to be able to say, whatever it is, yes, I'm here to do what's mine to do. I can't do everything, but what's mine to do, I'm here to do. And then the last word is not a word at all. It's just silence. And it's when we just realize at the end of the day, I don't need to say anything. But I'm held in the love and presence of God, and God is way bigger than I can understand. And whatever God is, I'm grateful and I'm in awe, and I certainly don't have God figured out in a little outline. But I don't need to say anything. And I'll just tell you a quick story before we open up for some questions or comments that helped me understand this. And it's so funny, this story means so much to me, but I've never put it in any of my books. I just keep forgetting. But my mother-in-law, my wife is 100% Sicilian. And my mother-in-law, I just loved her. She really was fantastic. And she really loved me. She sometimes wasn't sure how much she loved her daughter, but she really liked her son-in-law. They always butted heads, And, oh my goodness, she and I had some tender moments. Once she was dying, she had cancer. And it turned out she was just 3 or 4 weeks from her death, but she went out and bought a new car. A really expensive new car. And all of her kids were upset with her. Ma's in denial about her death. Ma doesn't get it. Ma, this is terrible, So Tony and I were in her car, and she couldn't drive. She wasn't well enough to drive, so I was driving her brand new car. And you know, there's something when you're in a car and you don't have to look at each other and it's dark, you know, so we're driving and Tony says, I know my kids are mad at me about buying this car. She said, they think it's because I'm in denial. She said, I just wanted to prove that I was still alive. And I don't know how many more times I'll get to be in this car, but I'm going to enjoy it. And thanks for driving. So that's the kind of person she was. She was just a great person. So shortly after her husband died, when my wife was 19, Grace, my wife, and Tony went out for a meal together. And they're sitting in a restaurant. And Tony says to Grace, I can tell, of all the couples sitting at these tables, I can tell which ones are married and which ones are dating. And Grace says, Ma, you're just looking at the rings on their finger. And she says, no, I'm not talking about that. I can tell. How can you tell, Ma? The ones that are talking are dating, and the ones that are quiet are married. So when Grace hears this, she is so upset because she feels like this is this deep confession from her mother that it's really boring to be married. You have nothing to say. And so this really affected Grace, and she was very hurt by this because she felt like it was a very cynical thing for her mother to say. So guess what? Whenever Grace and I would go out to a restaurant, she would make sure that we talked through the whole meal. Because she didn't want to be one of those boring old married couples where they have nothing to talk about. And, you know, it's really deeply affected her. So you can predict what happened. Oh, I don't know. This is 12, 15 years ago. Grace and I are in a restaurant, and we're just enjoying our meal, not saying a word. And suddenly Grace goes, oh, no. And I think she's going to say, we've become one of those boring old couples. But that's not what she said. She says, oh, no, I get it. She said, when I was sitting with my mother, I was driving her crazy by talking to her constantly. And she was missing her husband with whom she could sit and have a quiet meal in peace. And she was with someone, they knew each other so well that just being together was the joy. They didn't have to commentate on everything. Just being together was the joy. And she said she wasn't complaining about her marriage. She was missing one of the most precious things about a deep relationship, when you can be in silence together. Do you get that, you know? And she said, I see it. I see it. And I think that gave me an insight into a place where I think many of us find in our relationship with God. We just think to be in God's presence, it doesn't require words. And it's not less real for the silence. The silence is what makes it so precious. So I hope that might be a helpful way to you to think about how the spiritual life is, in a sense, just in terms of that internal attentiveness and relationship and connection to the Holy One. How it's dynamic and it's always changing, and there's new frontiers that are always there for us. And just as we said, if you think about the rings, even when you enjoy those periods of silence, it doesn't mean, it means that you still also often want to say thanks, and you still often need to say sorry, and you need to say help and please and when and no and why and behold, and it's all good, and it's all part of the spiritual life. So thank you for your attention, and we can open it up now for some questions or comments. I don't know if you want to start with some of them there. Thanks.
I love the resonance between the silence, which echoes back to the here, and then sitting under that tree again, and sort of coming back to the beginning, and as you said, built upon each other. Here is a question for you that I think we haven't tackled, and then this is just a note of appreciation from your earlier answers.
Great.
Yeah.
Are we seeing end stage 3 or stage 4 folks fleeing back to safety of stage 1, rather than moving forward due to frustration or lack of courage to persevere? So what a great question. And my first thought, as in most good questions, is the answer has to be yes, but both. I think we do see some people just they reach their limit. If any of you are interested, on my website I have 2 short little ebooks. One is on bias, and there's also a podcast that I've done you might be interested in on glitches in our rationality that are called bias. And then the other one is on authoritarianism. And in this little ebook on authoritarianism, I became really intrigued with authoritarianism in 2015 during the Republican primary period, when I watched all of the Republican candidates vigorously oppose Donald Trump, and then one by one bow the knee to him. And the deference, you all remember Marco Rubio's obsequious deference, to him here in Florida. And I remember I said to my wife, like in January of 2015, Trump's going to win because he has some power over people. So I called a couple of psychologist friends of mine, both with PhDs, and I said, any literature you see that helps you understand what's going on, will you send me any articles, just things that you think are psychologically valid? And so this led me into sort of a period of study. And I found out that after World War II, a whole bunch of psychologists and sociologists started asking, how could this happen in Germany? How could this happen in Italy? How could this happen in Japan? And there was a Canadian researcher named Bob Altemeyer who became really kind of a leader in this field. And they started talking about something they called the authoritarian follower personality. And they developed some ways of testing this, and they tested it across cultures, nations, and they found pretty consistent, about 30% of people tested high for being potential authoritarian followers. And here's the idea. In fact, I can use an analogy from fish. Some researchers were doing research on guppies, and they found out that if you put 100 guppies in a pond and the shadow of a bird goes over the pond, about 6% of the guppies hide right away. They're super anxious, super responsive to danger. And then if you have a bigger shadow come over, more and more go away. But there are about another 6% that are not afraid of shadows the way other guppies are. So you have the most fearful 6% and the most fearless 6%. And here's what they found. The most fearless 6% were also the 6% that breed the most. They're also the 6% that get eaten the most. And the 6% that are most afraid seldom are eaten, and they have fewer progeny. And so you can sort of see how that a population would preserve a more danger-averse and a more danger-tolerant group. You can see how a population would sustain that. Well, if you think something like that happens in human populations, there's a group of us who are more susceptible to certain kinds of stressors. And what Bob Altemeyer and others found is that about 30% of us, if you get our shame level or our stress level to a certain point, we have this tipping point where we want an authoritarian leader to come in and fix things for us. And we flock to an authoritarian leader because the pain of the shame or the stress is so great that we find relief in this. And other people just aren't attracted, they aren't triggered the same way, But you know what? If the stress level goes high enough, almost everybody eventually becomes susceptible to that. And I think part of what's going on is stress levels are going up in our world for a whole bunch of reasons. One of them being that a whole lot of people make a whole lot of money by keeping us afraid. Our fear and anger are one of the most profitable realities in the world right now. Because if I can make you afraid, you'll stay on Facebook, reading more Facebook pages, and then Facebook will make more money by selling ads to keep you afraid. And you'll watch more cable television. I mean, watch this. If you watch the morning news on television, almost every day it'll be, scientists report a new danger from your shampoo. Details right after the break, you know. And they know this keeps you watching. And so it works. It's the way our brains are wired. So if we just think a huge part of our culture right now is being stressed with the ubiquity of media and you know, these little propaganda devices that just, in a sense, become almost addictive to us, because if we haven't been made to feel anxious or angry lately, we need our hit. And we can go find a hit so quickly. So if we're raising people's stress and so on, then we shouldn't be surprised, exactly as this question suggests, that many people are reverting to stage one and looking for an authority figure to give them all the answers, to tell them who the good guys are and the bad guys are, and so on. And it's just, and this is one of the reasons why I think we have to help people in stages 2 and 3 move forward rather than backward. Because if we get more and more people moving back to stage 1, one of the characteristics of people in stage 1 is they're willing to suffer for their cause. But one of their other characteristics is they're willing to make other people suffer for their cause. And so this is it's just a danger that I think we have to try to get through somehow. So I think that's certainly part of it. Part of what's going on. But the other part of it is that there are more and more people moving into stages 2, 3, and 4, and it's making people in stage 1 be afraid. Are they going to be left alone? And here's the other part of it. If people in stage 2 and 3 are insulting and shaming people in stage 1 and making fun of them and mocking them, and calling them names and humiliating them, guess what we're doing? We're raising their stress and shame levels, which will make them even more susceptible to an authoritarian leader. And this is one of our great challenges right now. We have a lot of stage 3 people who spend almost all their time thinking they're going to shame stage 1 people into becoming more like them. And when you put that cocktail together, you have a vicious cycle that is really, really hard to break out of. So a lot more we could say about that. Let's move on. Is there another question or comment before we? Yes.
You can go ahead and say it.
My 100-year-old mother, Dorothy, is listening from home, and she asks, the Bible says God spoke. And her question is God still speaking?
Oh, what a great question.
And my addition to that would be how?
Yes. Oh, well, thank you. What's her name? Dorothy. Thank you, Dorothy. What a great question. So let me make a proposal when we think about the Bible. What if, well, actually, I'll begin with a quote from my dear friend and colleague, Richard Rohr, who says, let this set in. To me, this is like a wise old saying that everybody should think about. The steps to maturity are necessarily immature. The steps to maturity are necessarily immature. So unless you start at maturity, unless you're perfect to begin with, everything you do on your road to maturity will be more or less immature. And if we can get in the category of mature and immature rather than right and wrong or true and false, this might help us in reading the Bible. So then what we do is we say, we go back in the biblical story and we see these are ways that people are talking about God as they best understand God at their level of maturity, at their point of development in history. And they do the very, very best they can to explain what God is like where they are. But if you read the Bible, what you find out is, back in Genesis chapter 2 or 3, they thought about God this way, but you get to the end of Genesis, they think about God very differently. You get to Exodus, they really think about God differently. You get to Job, and you find out they're having all kinds of arguments about God. And so what if we were to say what the Bible gives us is a record of the conversation that people are having at different stages of maturity about God? And our job is not to go back and say, I have to think just like somebody thought about God back then, or then, but rather, I have to look at this ongoing conversation and trajectory, and I want to listen to the conversation up to this point, and I want to take part in the conversation as it moves forward. Does that make sense? So what that would do is it would say, another saying from that I learned from Richard Rohr. It's an old quote from the scholastic theologians in the Middle Ages. I'm going to give it to you in Latin just to impress you, because I worked hard to learn it. But it's quid recipitur ad modum recipientis recipitur, which means that which is received according to the manner of the receiver. I'll try it one more time. That which is received according to the manner of the receiver. So, if people in stage 1 receive a message from God, they can only receive it as stage 1 people. And they truly receive it. And what they receive is the very best word of God that they can receive, being where they are. They aren't ready to receive what you could receive at stage 2. Does that make sense? And they aren't ready to receive what they could receive at stage 3. So, if you look at the Bible in this way, and this is a really big oversimplification, but I think it kind of works. You could say in stage 1, the first part of the Bible, we get law. That the way that people relate to God is primarily around law. So that's what you need to get started. Right, wrong, good, bad, us, them, clean, unclean, all that sort of thing. But eventually you go beyond that. And you get to stage 2. And now what you need is wisdom. And so you have Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job, books that challenge you to think and ask new questions. And so now you go from law to wisdom. And you gain a lot of wisdom, stage 2. Then come the prophets. And what do the prophets do? The prophets say, you people keeping the law, you're still treating the poor like dirt. And all of your law keeping makes God sick. Now, does that mean that the stage 1 people were wrong for keeping the law? No, it means that when you grow to stage 3, you start caring about justice. And the prophets have so much critique of all the stage 1 and stage 2 people. And then you live with the prophets for a while, which is perfectly stage 3. And then Jesus comes on the scene. And actually, many of the prophets anticipated all of these things that Jesus said. For example, Jesus once, in fact, he does this 2 or 3 times in the Gospels. He quotes a little-known passage in Hosea that says, where God says, I desire mercy or compassion and not sacrifice. Now, do you understand what a radical saying that is? All those sacrifices that you were given back in stage 1, now people hear God saying, I never really wanted sacrifice. What I really wanted from you is love and compassion. And in a sense, that brings you to stage 4, where compassion and love are what it's really about. So it's not a simple answer to that question, because I don't think there is one. If we wanted to say, well, is God still speaking? The simple answer would be yes. And then the step 2, complicated answer would be say, how can we hear God speaking? And And one way is by noticing the way that people understood God differently through time, and then we keep moving forward, and we'll be able to hear what's ours to learn at this stage, keeping in mind, I'm just doing this to impress you. Quid recipitur, ad modum recipientis recipitur. That which is received according to the manner of the receiver. So thank you. Well, I think our time is about up. Thanks, everyone, for your attention.
Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to move to Eve's Garden. If you brought a book, I know there's a shortage of books going on, but if you brought a book, any of Brian McLaren's books, he'll be signing them in Eve's Garden. I want to draw your attention to the flip side of that welcome card, even if you didn't fill one out. And if you did and haven't turned it in, just put it right here. We'll collect them, and we're grateful for that. Our next event's coming up. Julianne Clayton will be, it's not our immediately next event, but Julianne Clayton will be our Advent Luncheon speaker this year. We'll be in Alfred Hall. She'll be speaking about waiting, what we are so impatient and don't love doing. That'll be on December 6th. We're delighted. She's actually here, sitting in midway through right there. And we'll continue this series. Again, you can find a lot of information about the Front Porch on our St. John's web page itself under About, and the Front Porch is right there. Click on that link, save it as a bookmark. We will continue to keep you updated, and of course the rest of the events are on the flip side of this welcome card. Thank you for joining us today. We are delighted you are here and look forward to seeing you again. Brian, let's head to the garden.